Welcome back for some more AP Bio. This is going to be dealing with not molecular, but classical genetics or Mendelian genetics. So we're going to look specifically at the role of probability in determining outcomes. They ask a little bit about this on the AP test. A little bit of a historical perspective. Once upon a time ago, the way that we thought that offspring were made were sperm and egg would run into each other, but inside of each sperm and inside of each egg was a baby version of a human called a homunculus. What would happen is sperm would run into egg, and the two baby people would kind of fuse together and make the offspring. Turns out that didn't work. Before we get too much further, there's a whole bunch of terms that show up. So there are words like homozygous and heterozygous and allele and dominant, recessive and phenotype and genotype. All these you can look up quite easily. I'm not going to spend time on this video giving you just definitions. You can look these up. So this guy, Gregor Mendel, he wanted to be a science teacher, and it turned out he couldn't pass the tests because he got too nervous to give the test or to pass the tests. They were oral exams. And so he took a job that gave him food, shelter, and space, and called that being a monk. And what he did was he examined pea plants, which is pism. And he would keep track meticulously of which plant was reproducing with which plant. And he knew the histories, the genealogies of all of the plants. And the result of all of this was he amassed thousands upon thousands upon thousands of data points from which he could do some statistics. He didn't derive these laws. Others derived them on his behalf, and they now referred to as Mendel's laws, but he came up with 3 rules, or laws. The law of segregation, the law of dominance, and the law of independent assortment. Turns out of these, only one of them is really true. The others are not necessarily true. So the first law of segregation, what that said, was the only way that he could describe patterns that he saw. Meaning taking 2 plants, reproducing them, and him getting 3-to-1 ratios of the offspring. The only way he could explain that is if whatever that character was, so character meaning flower color, it somehow split itself apart. There were 2 versions of it. One that could be passed on through the pollen, through the male, and one that was passed on through the eggs and the ovary, which was the female. The only way he could explain it was that way. Only way to make sense of the math. So he calls that the law of segregation. The law of dominance is now we have these 2 choices. We call them alleles now. One of them will cover up the other. So as you look at this picture, the purple is covering up the white. So we'd call the purple the dominant allele, or the dominant version of the flower color. And white would be what we would call the recessive allele, or the recessive version of flower color. The last one, which is independent assortment, deals with what he looked at. Turns out he looked at 7 different traits. So flower color, where the flowers were, the seed color, the seed, if they're smooth or wrinkled, the pod shape, the pod color, and how tall these things were. He looked at all of those traits. And what he noticed was how one was passed on didn't get paired up with another, meaning you could have a purple axial flower, but you could also have a purple terminal flower. You could have a white axial flower and a white terminal flower. It didn't pair up. You could separate all the traits apart, and we call that independent assortment. Turns out he got beautiful results using these 7. We'll talk later on in the year why he got perfect results, but it turns out you could explain everything that he did using statistics. And there turn out to be 3 rules in statistics. One of them is called the AND rule, which is if you have 2 requirements, meaning I must have this condition met and I need this condition met. What you do is the probability of condition 1 and the probability of condition 2 multiply. So what are the odds of having 2 boys in a row? The odds of a boy is 50%. Odds of a boy is 50%. The odds of getting both, so I need boy and boy, I multiply 50% by 50%, and I get, that's right, 25%. So half times half gets you a quarter. That's the AND rule. The OR rule is we have choices. So what are your odds of being a boy or a girl? Well, Boy is 50%, girl is 50%. Therefore, if I add them up, 50% plus 50% gets me 100%. The and rule is you multiply. The or rule is we add up. There's one other rule, and it's implied, but I'm making it explicit, and that's the 100% rule. All possibilities add up to 100%. So if there are 5 possible outcomes, the probabilities of all 5 of those better add up to being 100%. If there are only 2 possible outcomes, then they better add up to being 100%. That's what the 100% rule plays out to be. Well, we can't do Mendel's experiments on humans. What we can do instead is we look at the past, and what we create are these pictures that we call pedigrees, where when you look at this, squares are males, circles are females, line between them means they are a pair, line dropping down beneath them tells you they had offspring. Typically, if you see a box or a square filled in, or a circle or a square filled in, what that means is the individual has the trait. As you move from left to right, we typically put them in order by age, or at least of the main family. And the way we reference them is, so if we look way up here at the top, we would call the father 1, 1. The mother would be 1, 2. Next row, we'd have 2, 1, 2, 2, 2, 3, 2, 4, 2, 5, 2, 6, 2, 7. They just list in order. What you can immediately derive from this is the type of inheritance pattern found in this trait. This is a recessive trait, and here's how I know. If I look at 1, 1, and 1, 2, neither one has the trait. But if I look at 2, 3, 2, 3 has the trait. She has the trait. Well, her parents didn't show it, but she has it. What that meant was their parents, 1, 1, and 1, 2, they were carriers. They were heterozygous for this trait, and it just happened to combine, and the second daughter got it. Therefore, it's a recessive trait. We look at this, or we use pedigrees in order to figure out the probabilities of getting genetic disorders. And you would go to genetic counselor, and there are other versions that may or may not be better than this. I don't know. I don't use them, or at least I haven't so far. But what you can do is analyze what are the odds of passing on a trait that is detrimental, if you know that it exists in your family. And it requires a lot of finding out everything you can about everyone in your family, and do they have it, do they not have it? Well, do their kids have it? Do they marry someone who has it? Let's go for cousins, let's go for second cousins, let's go for third cousins. We look as far as we can. There's one thing in here that's kind of odd, and that's this odd double line thing right here. That double line is for what we would call a consanguineous marriage, or a consanguineous reproduction. Consanguineous means incest. Well, why would I say that? Because if you take a look, 4, 4, and 4, 5 are cousins. And that makes it so it's definitely incest. Why is that worth pointing out? Number one, it explains what that symbol is. But number two, incest tends to make for purity in a gene pool, making everything aligned up because we're not adding variation. The catch with that is if there's a genetic abnormality, it's going to show up a lot faster. So you have an individual who is dominant for a trait, and the question is that person homozygous or is that person heterozygous? Is the person a carrier or is the person pure? Or organism, it doesn't need to be a person. And Mendel developed a very interesting way to solve that puzzle, and it's what we refer to as a back cross. So what you do is you cross your unknown with an absolute known, and the absolute known is always going to be the recessive. So if you were to take this purple plant, this purple flower, we don't know if it's dominant or recessive, but if I reproduce, or if it's not dominant or recessive, but if it's heterozygous or homozygous. So if I cross this purple flower with a white flower, the white flower is going to be masked no matter what. So if the purple flower is purely dominant, it is homozygous dominant, it is pure breeding, what you would notice is all of the offspring should be that dominant color. They should all be purple. If, however, you cross this purple flower with a white flower, and the purple flower turns out to be heterozygous. It is a carrier. What you would notice is, genetically speaking, half of them will be purple, half of them will be white, which means I know that the original was heterozygous. The catch with all of this stuff is it's fun, it's good, you learn it in the 7th grade, you learn it in regular biology. A whole lot of it doesn't work. And we're going to spend more time in the year figuring out how it doesn't work.